In 1898, one man started a war to sell more newspapers. Every cent of profit from that war became an invisible brick in the walls of America's most insane castle. He fed the nation lies. His motto, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." And on his yacht, he may have killed a man. His pet zebras still roam the hills of California. But this story isn't about money, and it's not even about power. You think he built this palace for himself? We will show you how America's grandest structure became a weapon in a personal war, a war against a single feeling that haunted him his entire life. La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. That's what he named this place, and in the rays of the California sun, it almost lives up to its name. The air, saturated with salt and the scent of eucalyptus, rings with hundreds of voices. The clicks of camera shutters never cease for a second, reflecting off the white marble and azure water. Every day, thousands of people arrive here to touch someone else's impossible dream. The guide recites rehearsed phrases: 165 rooms, 61 bathrooms, 12,000 square meters of marble and gold, the Roman pool decorated with 1.5 million tiles of Venetian glass, the Neptune pool holding 345,000 gallons of water with the facade of a real ancient temple bought in Italy and transported across the ocean. The numbers sound like incantations, like an attempt to measure greatness. Tourists nod, marvel, take selfies in front of 16th century tapestries, and pose by statues that remember the time of the pharaohs. They see a palace, a fairy tale, the apotheosis of the American dream. But the day is short. With the last bus carrying away the daytime guests, the voices fall silent. The iron gates close with a dull, final groan, and then the enchanted hill begins to shed its bright mask. The sun sinks into the Pacific Ocean, and the shadows, which had been hiding under the arches, stretch out, merging into a solid velvet of twilight. A chill begins to rise from the stone. Now it's not a palace, it is a colossus, left alone with the wind and the stars. A gigantic skeleton, whose bones glisten white atop a wild hill. In the ensuing silence, you can hear the wind, lost in the Spanish towers, singing its lonely song. The windows, which an hour ago reflected the sun, turn into black, blind abysses. Behind them lie labyrinths of rooms, where on monastery tables, a dinner never served for over half a century grows cold, where the fire in cave-sized fireplaces has long since gone out, where the silk banners of French kings and the carved ceilings of Spanish cathedrals are drowning in a still, thick darkness. This house watches. It remembers the clinking of glasses and the quiet whisper of conspiracies. It remembers the laughter of Hollywood stars and the heavy, imperious stride of its master. Now, its halls are empty. Echo has become the sole inhabitant of these walls. Whose mind, whose will erected this Babylon on a wild Californian slope, hundreds of miles from civilization? Who dared to challenge nature itself, carving roads where there were none and forcing water to flow uphill? And why, after achieving the impossible, did he leave behind only this grand, cold silence? The story of this place is not a chronicle of triumph. It is physical evidence, an exhibit in a case where the defendant is common sense and the crime is a war declared unreality by a single man, a war that began long before the first stone was laid here. The foundation of this castle was not laid here on a sunny hill, but deep underground in the muck and gloom of 19th century Nevada. There, where men with scorched faces and broken backs tore a fortune from the dead rock. His father, George Hearst, was a man of this breed, crude, uneducated, but with an animal instinct for wealth. He could smell silver, copper, and gold the way a predator smells blood. The Comstock Lode, the Anaconda Mine, the Homestake Mine, these names sounded like the strike of a pickaxe on a stone. He clawed a fortune from the American earth, but he never understood the true nature of power. In 1880, in payment of a gambling debt, the San Francisco Examiner newspaper fell into his hands. A toy, a useless asset, paper that only devoured money. 7 years later, his son, William, a spoiled heir expelled from Harvard, demanded this toy for himself, and his father, with a smirk, gave it to him. He couldn't have known he was handing his son a weapon far more deadly and profitable than all his mines combined. William Randolph Hearst understood what his father did not. Real power doesn't come from beneath the ground, but from the pages of newspapers. It is born not from silver ingots, but from words printed in cheap black ink. He took a failing newspaper and turned it into a printing press that produced not news, but emotion, fear, anger, righteous indignation, blind patriotism. Headlines screamed, they didn't report. Illustrations shocked, they didn't inform. The news ceased to be a reflection of reality. It became its constructor. But the real war began in Cuba in 1898 as the island groaned under a Spanish oppression. Hearst saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. His newspapers, the New York Journal and the San Francisco Examiner, unleashed a flood of fabricated stories on the American public. Reports of Spanish atrocities, of the torture of innocent women, of the humiliation of the American flag. Most of it was a lie, the rest a monstrous exaggeration. But it worked. Legend has it that when his illustrator in Cuba telegraphed that there was no war, Hearst sent a reply that became the quintessence of his creed. You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war. He delivered. The explosion on board the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor became that very gift of fate. Without proof, but with deafening certainty, Hearst's newspapers blamed Spain for everything. Remember the Maine? To hell with Spain. The headlines roared. The country, fed on this fury, demanded blood, and the war began. While soldiers were dying in Cuba, the printing presses in New York never stopped for a minute. The journal's circulation exceeded 1 million copies a day. Every newspaper sold, every cent of profit, was washed in blood shed thousands of miles away. Hearst had proven it. War is the best-selling commodity. It was then, amidst the roar of those presses and the rustle of fresh newsprint, that the real castle on the enchanted hill was founded. Every issue sold, paid for with lies, became an invisible brick in its walls. Every fabricated story of suffering, a marble column. Every cent of profit from the war he had unleashed was a drop of mortar binding the stones of a future madness. The castle did not yet exist on earth, but it was already growing in his imagination, built on a foundation of cynicism and newsprint. Why not just a palace? Why not an elegant mansion in Newport, where the American aristocracy built their summer cottages, competing in understated luxury? The answer is simple. This castle was never meant to be lived in. It was conceived as a weapon, as an act of revenge. First and foremost, revenge against the ghost of his father. George Hearst was a titan who had ripped a fortune from the rocks, a man of the earth, of sweat and instinct. But in his son's eyes, he would forever remain a crude, uncultured prospector who considered the newspaper a useless toy. William, with his high-pitched voice and passion for antiques, was an alien to him. The castle on the hill was to become a monument to the culture his father despised, a rebuttal in stone and gold, screaming across the ages, "I am not just a rich man's son, I am a man of taste." It was revenge against Harvard, which had expelled him in disgrace for his hooliganism. The expulsion was not just a line in his biography, it was a brand. The brand of an outcast rejected by the East Coast establishment. They had closed the doors of their intellectual club to him. In response, he decided to build his own Acropolis, where the treasures of world culture would be gathered, accessible only by his personal invitation. His castle would become a university where he himself would be the sole professor, dean, and trustee. And finally, the deepest resentment born in his childhood during a trip to Europe, resentment toward the European aristocracy. He stood in their castles, looked at their portraits, and understood that he would never be one of them. He could buy up their tapestries, their silver, even their ancestral castles, but he could not buy their blood, their centuries of history. And so he made a decision, full of audacity and desperation. If he couldn't enter their history, then he would have to buy it piece by piece and reassemble it according to his own rules. For this crime against modesty, he needed more than just an architect. He needed an accomplice, an instrument of his will, capable of turning a mad fantasy into blueprints and calculations. In Julia Morgan, he found his perfect general, one of the first female architects in the world, a genius of reinforced concrete and a master of historical stylization. He didn't hire her to create a masterpiece. He hired her to be a co-conspirator in creating material proof of his greatness. The plan was simple and monstrous. He would not build an American house. He would dismantle European history, transport it across the ocean, and from its bones assemble his own unshakable myth, a fortress built not to defend against enemies, but to defend against a single feeling, the feeling that he was an outsider. In the beginning, there was only the hill, a wild, sun-scorched spine of rock, overgrown with dry grass and lonely oaks. For centuries, it slumbered beneath the Californian sky, indifferent to human ambition. Its laws were simple and immutable: the law of gravity, the law of thirst, the law of isolation. War came to this hill. This wasn't construction in the usual sense of the word. It was an invasion, a conquest. The first enemy was its very inaccessibility. Not a single path led to the summit. And so, hundreds of men, an army without banners, began to tear into the unyielding slope. Dynamite shattered the silence. Shovels and pickaxes bit into the stone. Slowly, meter by meter, they carved a road to nowhere, to a place where nothing yet existed. And then, from the coast itself, they began to pull a steel thread, a 3-mile railway, a private artery through which stolen European history would flow to the summit. Along these rails, creaking and groaning, wagons would crawl, laden with Spanish ceilings, Gothic fireplaces, Roman sarcophagi, and thousands of tons of cement. The second enemy was thirst. There wasn't a single drop of water on the hill. It was a stone desert, capable of sustaining only lizards and coyotes. But the man who envisioned this castle decided there would be gardens, fountains, and gigantic pools. And so, war was declared on the Santa Lucia Mountains. Engineers and workers went deep into the wilderness to find the source and turn its flow. For 12 kilometers, they laid a concrete vein through rock and ravines. 12 kilometers of aqueduct, so that water, defying the laws of nature, would flow upward to the hilltop, obeying only one law, the will of its new master. This battlefield had its own general, and she was a woman, Julia Morgan. She didn't sit in a luxurious office receiving reports. She lived here in a simple bungalow amidst the roar and the dust. She was the brain behind the client's mad will. It was she who waged the daily battle with logistics, counting sacks of cement and crates of antiques. It was she who fought against gravity, fitting multi-ton stone vaults into a reinforced concrete frame. And it was she who fought the most difficult battle against the impatience and whims of the man who paid for it all, but was thousands of miles away. Hundreds of workers, under the scorching sun and the piercing ocean wind, turned chaos into order. They were the nameless soldiers in this strange war, where the enemy was reality itself. They conquered it every day, raising walls where the earth resisted and planting trees where nothing could grow. The hill, the first and most stubborn opponent, slowly surrendered. Every stone of this castle is a trophy, won from nature. While the battle with stone and gravity raged on the enchanted hill, the god of this universe ruled his creation from afar. His throne was in New York, in a glass tower overlooking Central Park. From there, from the nerve center of his media empire, William Randolph Hearst directed the construction with a weapon faster than any ship, the telegraph. Every day, the teletype in Julia Morgan's modest on-site office tapped out a new volley of orders, whims, and revelations. Thousands of telegrams, short as a gunshot and imperious as a royal decree, flew across the continent. This was not a dialogue. It was a relentless bombardment of will. The Neptune pool is too small, looks like a puddle, redo it. And the workers, having just finished months of labor, would take up sledgehammers and reduce to ruins what had seemed a masterpiece only the day before, and then they would start over, doubling its size. This happened 3 times. Just bought a ceiling from a 15th century Spanish monastery. I want it in the library. The telegram didn't contain a question. It was a statement of fact. And it didn't matter that the library's walls were already built to completely different dimensions. Julia Morgan and her team would dismantle what was built, redraw the blueprints, and perform engineering miracles to squeeze the ancient, massive beams into the modern, reinforced concrete structure. The construction became a mad, surreal collage. This was not creation according to a single plan. It was a continuous mutation, a living, pulsating organism that changed its form at the whim of its creator. Rooms appeared and disappeared, walls moved, corridors changed direction. Already finished halls were demolished to make way for a new antique acquisition that Hearst had spotted in a European auction catalog. He wasn't building a building. He was playing with a gigantic, the world's most expensive construction set, where the pieces were fragments of other people's histories and civilizations. A Roman mosaic, a Gothic fireplace, Moorish tiles, a French tapestry. All of it was thrown into one cauldron, obeying only one law: I want it this way. The telegrams from this distant paper Babylon were nerve impulses that made the body of the castle shudder and change. They were proof of absolute power, the power not just to build, but to destroy what was built, the power to rewrite reality on the fly. The castle on the hill was not an architectural project. It was the physical embodiment of one man's consciousness, capricious, insatiable, and infinitely lonely in his omnipotence. Into the castle's cold, newborn walls life one day entered. It didn't arrive in a crate of antiques, nor was it delivered by rail. It arrived in an automobile, and its arrival was like sunlight breaking into a crypt. Her name was Marion Davies. She was an actress, bright, vibrant, with an infectious laugh and a slight stutter that she had turned into a part of her charm. To the world, she was the media mogul's mistress, a kept woman living in luxury. But for this castle, she became something more. She became its heart. Hearst, this grim king who was building a fortress against the world, erected it as a stage for his queen. He created a film studio for her, Cosmopolitan Productions. He forced all his newspapers and magazines to write glowing reviews about her. He poured millions into films that were supposed to make her the greatest star, but which often just shackled her comedic talent in ponderous historical dramas. And this castle was the culmination of his obsession. It was the most grandiose set ever created for a single actress. It was her laugh that first broke the echoing silence of the dining hall. It was her energy that made the place feel like a home, not a museum. She played pranks on pompous guests, mocked them behind Hearst's back, bringing an element of cheerful chaos to the strictly regulated life. She swam in the gigantic pools, rode Arabian stallions over the hills, and played tennis on courts built on an Olympic scale. She was the soul of this stone body, but behind this shining facade was a thin but a sturdy leash. Hearst adored her, but it was the love of an owner. He controlled her career, her social circle, even the amount of alcohol she drank. He built her a golden cage, the most luxurious in the world, and locked her inside it. Their bedrooms in the main house were connected by a secret corridor. His, the Gothic suite, was dark and austere, like a medieval monk's cell, hung with images of the Madonna and Child. Hers was a bright, almost frivolous Rococo-style room, full of mirrors and French furniture. Two different worlds connected by a secret door. This architectural choice held the entire essence of their relationship. The contrast between a vibrant, dependent woman, full of light and laughter, and a domineering, lonely man who created a paradise for her, only to rule it alone. She was his most prized acquisition, the only exhibit in his collection that had a living, beating heart. Every weekend, a private train from Los Angeles arrived at the foot of the Enchanted Hill. It brought tribute not to a king, but to a man who could create or destroy any career with a single stroke of a pen on an editorial page. Hollywood came to pay homage. Ascending the winding road to the castle were cars carrying the gods and goddesses of the silver screen. Charlie Chaplin, Clark Gable, Cary Grant, Greta Garbo, David Niven. They were traveling to this surreal kingdom to spend the weekend in a place unlike any other on Earth. During the day, the guests were left to their own devices. They could swim in the Neptune pool, its white columns reflecting in the azure water. They could play tennis on immaculate courts or ride purebred Arabian horses. The host himself spent this time working, locked away in his Gothic library, managing a newspaper empire that spanned the entire country. But as twilight fell, the ritual began. At precisely 8 in the evening, everyone was required to assemble in the reception hall. Tardiness was considered an unforgivable insult. The host would descend the staircase, and a short cocktail hour would commence. The rule was ironclad, 1 cocktail per person, no more. Then the enormous dining room doors would swing open, and the guests would enter a hall that could have housed an abbey. Beneath a carved 16th century ceiling, Among Flemish tapestries depicting scenes from the life of Scipio Africanus stood a gigantic refectory table. It could seat 40 people. Guests took their places on antique choir stalls brought from a Spanish cathedral, and liveried servants began to serve the food. And here, in the very heart of this European fantasy, reality would strike back. On the table that remembered the prayers of medieval monks, next to heavy English silver, stood ordinary bottles of Heinz ketchup and mustard. And on the guests' laps lay not linen, but paper napkins. Hearst considered them more hygienic. The food, too, was simple, American fare: fried chicken, steaks, hot dogs served on silver platters. This was not a European court. It was the dictatorship of an American nouveau riche. He had assembled the scenery of the old world, but filled it with his own unshakable rules. He could talk for hours about the origin of each tapestry, yet demand that everyone watch the latest Marion Davies film in his private movie theater. The feast of this monarch was brilliant, unforgettable, but at its core lay not etiquette, but caprice. And the most famous people in the world silently complied because they understood they were not guests. They were temporary ornaments in his collection. Behind the glittering facade of hospitality lay another reality, woven from invisible threads of control. The paradise built on the hill had its own laws, and the chief among them was the law of its creator's omniscience. Freedom ended at the telephone. The castle had its own switchboard with 52 lines, and each one was an artery leading directly to the master's ears. Every call to the outside world passed through a vigilant operator. A request to be connected sounded like a plea for mercy. Private conversations were impossible. The guests quickly learned that the walls here were not just stone. They were a membrane catching every whisper, every careless word. The private lives left at the foot of the hill were nullified here. Everyone became a character in a play directed by, and with a sole audience of, William Randolph Hearst. But the main object of this total surveillance was her, Marion. The one cocktail rule was not for the guests. It was for her. Every evening, as the butler made the rounds with a tray, Hearst's eyes, cold and watchful, followed her hand. One glass, and that was it. After that, the bar was closed. This wasn't concern. It was an act of power, a public demonstration of control over her weakness. This control extended far beyond the dining room. He managed her career with the stubbornness of a tyrant. Marion Davies was a gifted comedic actress, light, sparkling, able to make you laugh with a single glance. But Hearst saw her differently. He saw her as Joan of Arc, Marie Antoinette, a tragic heroine in heavy historical costumes. He poured millions into lavish but lifeless productions that flopped at the box office one after another, burying her true talent under the weight of his ambitions. He chose not only her roles, but also her friends. Anyone he thought might have a bad influence on her would vanish without a trace from the guest list. Jealousy, suspicion, and the desire for absolute possession turned the castle into an elegant prison. The guests, even the most famous, sensed it. They were temporary captives. Their presence was necessary to create the illusion of festivity and high society, but their freedom was limited by a schedule set by the host. One could not simply leave. Transportation to the nearest station ran on his schedule. Getting lost in the endless corridors, one could wander for hours, feeling like a character in a Gothic novel. The castle, built as a paradise, was in fact the most perfect mechanism of isolation. Some couldn't take it. The screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, once, intoxicated less by alcohol than by the oppressive atmosphere, caused a public scene at the dinner table. He was immediately thrown out, but Mankiewicz didn't wait for the host's transportation. He escaped, literally fled on foot down the hill, desperately hitchhiking on the deserted road until a passing car picked him up. This escape was not just a drunken stunt. It was an act of desperation, a breakout from a golden cage whose glitter blinded the eyes, but whose bars were forged from the unshakable will of one man. For most, it was just a weekend, but for Marion Davies, it was her entire life. A life spent at the center of a grand stage, under the sleepless gaze of her director, producer, and jailer. In November of 1924, a white yacht departed from a pier in San Pedro. Her name was the Oneida. This was not merely a vessel, it was a floating throne, a maritime extension of the castle on the hill, isolated from the world by the boundless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Aboard were the creme de la creme of Hollywood. The occasion was festive. The yacht was sailing to San Diego to celebrate the 45th birthday of one of the most influential film producers of his time, Thomas Ince. The air was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and music. William Randolph Hearst was in his element, a monarch receiving his vassals in his floating dominion. Beside him was Marion Davies, radiant and carefree. And of course, Charlie Chaplin, whose wit and charm made him the center of any gathering. But beneath the thin veneer of celebration, tension was brewing. Hearst's jealousy of Chaplin was an open secret. He saw how Marion laughed at his jokes, saw their easy, casual intimacy, and his face would harden. He, who had built an empire for her, could not compete with the charm of the tramp with a cane. And it was here, in this floating cage, to the whisper of the waves, that the darkest chapter of the Hearst legend unfolded, a story that was never printed in his newspapers, a story whispered from person to person throughout Hollywood. On Saturday evening, Thomas Ince, the guest of honor, began to feel unwell. The official version, which would appear later, stated indigestion, an ulcer flare-up. He was hastily taken off the yacht in San Diego and sent home, where he died of a heart attack 2 days later. The case was closed, but Hollywood is a village where there are no secrets, only poorly kept ones. And through this village crept another, far more terrifying rumor. They spoke of a note, an intercepted letter from Marion to Chaplin. They spoke of Hearst, blinded by rage, bursting into a cabin uninvited. That, in the dim light, he saw a silhouette and fired, aiming for Chaplin, but hitting Ince, who had entered the cabin at the wrong moment. This was just one version. Another claimed the bullet was meant for Marion. A third, that the shot was accidental, fired during a scuffle. The details varied, but at the center of every story was a pistol in Hearst's hand and a fatal wound to Thomas Ince's head. From that moment on, an operation to erase reality began. The power of the media empire, created to shape public opinion, was now deployed to bury a single story. The first victim was the truth. The doctor who boarded the yacht later admitted that Ince was alive but bleeding from a gunshot wound. The official death certificate made no mention of it. The second victim was the body of Thomas Ince. He was cremated so hastily that an autopsy, which could have put an end to the matter, became impossible. Then came the witnesses. Chaplin's secretary, a Japanese immigrant, had allegedly seen the wounded Ince. Shortly after the incident, she was given a lifetime pension and sent to Mexico for good. Another actress who was on board suddenly received a lucrative contract with Hearst's studio. Silence was handsomely paid for. But the most deafening sound in this story is the silence. Not one of the 28 newspapers owned by Hearst printed a single line about the death of one of Hollywood's biggest producers. No obituary, no condolences. Thomas Ince simply vanished. He was erased. We will never know what really happened on the Oneida that November evening, but the incident on the yacht became a moment of truth. For the first time, the shadow behind the eccentric collector's throne became visible to all. The shadow of a man with the power not only to create reality on the front pages of his newspapers, but to destroy it when it got in his way. The castle on the hill was his fortress. The yacht was his floating fortress. But on that night, the ocean could not hide his secret. It merely carried it like a quiet, sinister whisper all across the world. For decades, his enemies had been predictable. Politicians who could be bought or destroyed with compromising material. Business competitors who could be ruined. Public opinion that could be shaped by a screaming headline. He was used to the idea that everything and everyone had a price. But in 1940, an opponent of a new, unprecedented kind appeared on his battlefield. He couldn't be intimidated because he was too audacious. He couldn't be bought because he craved not money, but glory. His name was Orson Welles, a boy, a 25-year-old wunderkind who came to Hollywood from the world of radio and theater, where his voice was already hypnotizing the nation. He arrived in California not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror, with a contract that gave him unprecedented creative freedom. And he decided to land his first blow on the biggest idol of the American Olympus. His weapon was not the newspaper column, but the film reel. The film he made was called Citizen Kane. It wasn't just a biography, it was an autopsy performed without anesthesia, using light and shadow. On the operating table lay the soul of a man who had everything, but died alone, clutching a glass sphere and whispering a single word, Rosebud. On the screen appeared the newspaper magnate Charles Foster Kane, a man who built a media empire on lies and sensations, a man who started a war for the sake of circulation, a man who tried to turn his talentless mistress into an opera singer, a man who lived in a gigantic unfinished castle stuffed with priceless treasures from around the world, a castle named Xanadu. This wasn't just a movie, it was a public execution. It was a mirror, polished to a merciless shine, that Welles held up to the face of William Randolph Hearst. And in that mirror, the aging magnate saw not a titan, but a monster, a distorted, pathetic caricature of himself. The war was declared after a private screening for the Hollywood elite. Among the audience was Luella Parsons, the chief society columnist of the Hearst Empire, his eyes and ears in the world of cinema. Seeing the unconcealed mockery of her boss and his mistress on a screen, she ran out of the theater in horror and rushed to a telephone. Her call to the castle on the hill was the signal for battle. The immense, slumbering machine of the Hearst Empire shuddered and awoke. 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, 8 radio stations. This entire armada was unleashed to destroy a single film. The order was simple. Citizen Kane must not exist. A total information blockade began. In Hearst's publications, It was forbidden not only to review the film, but even to mention its title in movie theater advertisements. For the 20 million readers of his newspapers, the film simply did not exist. It was erased from reality. Then the pressure on the entire film industry began. Hearst threatened to publish compromising material on all the Hollywood bosses, actors, and directors if the studio, RKO Pictures, released the film. A smear campaign against Welles himself was launched. He was called a communist, a draft dodger, an immoral upstart. All the dirty tricks of yellow journalism, which Hearst himself had once invented, were put into play. He even tried to buy the film's negative in order to publicly burn it, to destroy not just the copies, but the very source, the original itself, which dared to capture him in such a light. But he lost. Welles and the studio held their ground. The film was released in 1941. It failed at the box office. The blockade had done its job, but it survived. Art proved to be an enemy that could not be destroyed with newspaper ink. Hearst, the master of manipulation, for the first time encountered a force that was beyond his control. He was shooting cannons at a ghost captured on celluloid, and that ghost won. From that moment on, his castle on the Enchanted Hill acquired a new cursed name. For the whole world, it became Xanadu forever. Fiction proved to be stronger than the stone. Orson Welles stole from Hearst the most precious thing of all, control over his own story. The man who had spent his life writing the stories of others lost power over his own. Collecting was his passion, his sickness, his way of owning the world. He didn't just collect objects, he collected centuries. The ceiling of a Spanish monastery, a Greek sarcophagus, the bed of Cardinal Richelieu. Each item was a fragment of history, torn from its context and placed in his personal treasury. But there was one collection that surpassed all others, a collection that was a symbol of his absolute, almost divine power. He didn't just collect art, he collected life itself. On the slopes of the Enchanted Hill, on an area of hundreds of acres, he built the largest private zoo in the world. It was not just a menagerie, it was a living map of his imperial ambitions. Ships brought living trophies from every continent. From the Arctic ice, polar bears, for whom a special pool with ice-cold water was built. From the African savanna, lions, giraffes, elephants, and antelopes. From South America, jaguars and llamas. From Australia, kangaroos and emus. Along the road leading to the castle, enclosures stretched for miles, where these exotic creatures lived and died for the amusement of their master and his guests. This was the ultimate expression of power, not just to buy a statue of a lion, but to bring a living lion and make it roar at your command, not just to hang a tapestry depicting a deer, but to release a herd of real deer onto your lands. Guests ascending to the castle would drive through this surreal landscape. They saw giraffes nibbling the tops of California oaks. They heard the roar of grizzly bears echoing off the hills. They watched zebras and Barbary sheep grazing on the slopes, as if this were not California, but the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. The zoo was living proof that the will of one man could change nature itself. But reality has its own laws, and the most important of them is the law of gravity, which acts not only on stones, but also on financial empires. In the 30s, the world was gripped by the Great Depression. The newspapers that once brought fabulous profits began to lose readers and advertisers. The Colossus, built on a foundation of newsprint, began to teeter. Debts grew, and creditors became more insistent. And when the time came to pay the bills, the first victims were those who could not stand up for themselves, the collection that could not be sold, the animals. Maintaining this Noah's Ark cost a fortune. Feed, care, veterinarians, all of it required money that was no longer there. And then the order was given that marked the beginning of the end, the order to dismantle the zoo. It was not just an act of economy, it was an act of surrender. The symbol of absolute power crumbled to dust. Some of the animals were sold to city zoos across the country. Those that couldn't be sold were simply killed. But some were given their freedom. The cages were opened. And onto the hills of California, onto land that had never been their home, stepped creatures from another world. Dozens of zebras, whose black and white stripes looked strange against the golden grass. Herds of Barbary sheep, whose curved horns had never seen the cliffs of Africa. The descendants of these animals still roam the surrounding hills to this day. They became feral, they adapted, they became part of this landscape, ghosts of that mad dream. The image of exotic animals released into the wild and scattering across the California landscape became the most precise metaphor for the impending chaos. It was a rehearsal for the coming fall. The loss of control over his menagerie was a harbinger of the loss of control over his entire empire. The king was beginning to lose his kingdom. There's a tour not shown to tourists, a route that isn't in any guidebook. To walk it, you must turn away from the gleaming marble floors, bypass the tapestries and the gilding, and step into a place where the myth ends and harsh reality begins. This is a journey into the heart of an unfinished creation. Behind the luxurious guest houses, hidden from view by cypress trees, stand concrete boxes, ghosts, skeletons of the wings and halls that were meant to be the crowning achievement, but remained only in Julia Morgan's blueprints and in the imagination of her client. Here, in these echoing empty spaces, the castle tells the truth. Rough, gray walls of reinforced concrete, with rusted rebar jutting out like broken ribs. On the floor, construction debris petrified over the decades, and the tracks of work boots frozen in the cement like the footprints of long-extinct animals. There was supposed to be a ballroom here, a bowling alley, dozens more guest bedrooms, but instead, there's only a cold, silent space where the wind roams, howling through empty window frames. This is not just an unfinished building, it is a monument to an ambition that turned out to be bigger than life, bigger than money, bigger than time. The most candid admission of defeat is not here, but deep underground in the cellars that stretch for hundreds of meters beneath the main house. There, in the dry, cool darkness, lie treasures that never saw the light of day. Hundreds, thousands of wooden crates covered in a thick layer of dust. On many of them, stenciled labels are still visible. Marseille, Genoa, London. This is an army that arrived on the battlefield but was never sent into action. In these crates, as if in sarcophagi, lies a stolen history. Entire rooms, dismantled plank by plank from European palazzos, marble statues wrapped in burlap yellowed with age, carved doors that will never be opened, thousands of square meters of antique tile that will never be laid, enormous fireplaces that will never warm anyone with their heat. This is a cemetery of artifacts, a necropolis of unfulfilled plans. Hearst bought up the world with the insatiable greed of a collector who believes that possessing things gives one power over time. He bought faster than Julia Morgan could build. He hoarded treasures like a dragon, but never had time to adorn his entire lair. These warehouses are the most honest place in the entire castle. There is no gilding to hide the concrete, no silk to drape over the cracks. Here, there are only crates, endless rows of crates, each one an unfulfilled promise, a frozen whim. They stand here in the silence and the dark, witnesses to how America's greatest construction project choked on its own ambitions. The castle was never meant to be finished, because it was not a goal, but a process of asserting power, of demonstrating wealth, a process of endlessly bending reality to his will. And when that process stopped, the castle died. It turned into a monument, a gigantic, luxurious ruin, frozen halfway to its never-achieved perfection. Unfinishedness became its main feature, its essence, its sentence. It is a symphony without a finale. The music was cut off mid-measure, leaving behind only a deafening, eternal silence. 1937, America was writhing in the agony of the Great Depression. Millions were out of work. Factories stood idle, dust-covered abandoned farms. For a long time, it seemed that the Enchanted Hill was an island, an impregnable fortress that no economic storm could breach. While the country starved, an endless feast continued here. Cement flowed like a river, marble arrived from Italy, workers received their paychecks. The castle was a small state with its own economy, running on the money of a single man. But even titans are not immune to earthquakes. The wave born on Wall Street in '29 rolled slowly but inexorably across the entire continent. And now, 8 years later, it reached the foot of the hill. Hearst's empire, that colossus on feet of newsprint, began to crack. Advertising revenues dried up, circulations fell, the stocks he had invested millions in turned to dust. But he, like a king refusing to believe in a rebellion, kept on spending. He kept buying antiques, kept rebuilding his castle, kept living as if nothing had changed. But numbers don't lie. They cannot be edited. The Hearst Corporation's debt reached $126 million. In today's money, that's over $2.5 billion, a sum capable of sinking a nation. The creditors, bankers with cold eyes and nerves of steel, were no longer willing to wait. They came not as petitioners, but as bailiffs. They walked into his New York office and presented him with an ultimatum. Control over his entire empire would pass to them. He, William Randolph Hearst, the man who had dictated his will to America for decades, was removed from power. He, the owner of it all, was put on an allowance, $500,000 a year. For an ordinary person, a fortune. For him, a humiliating handout from his own money. It was not just a financial defeat, it was a dethronement. The king had been stripped of his crown, and the first decree of the new rulers, these faceless accountants, was to cease all pointless expenditures, the chief among them being the castle. One day, in that same fateful year of '37, a telegram arrived at the construction site in San Simeon. It was addressed to Julia Morgan. It contained no apologies, no explanations. There were no emotions, no regrets, just 3 short, clipped words, like a gunshot. Stop all work. And that was it. It was not an order, it was an epitaph. For Julia Morgan, who had dedicated 28 years of her life to this place, it was the end of an era. For the hundreds of workers for whom the construction was the only salvation from unemployment, it was the end of hope. In an instant, everything froze. The hammers fell silent, the winches stopped. The mortar hardened in its tubs. The men gathered their tools and silently left the hill, leaving behind unfinished walls and silence. The great construction, this war with reality that had lasted for nearly 3 decades, was over. It ended not with a triumphant completion, but with a sudden, shameful halt. The death telegram, sent by a man who was no longer the master of his own destiny, cut the symphony short. The castle on the hill froze in time, forever remaining a monument not only to titanic ambition, but also to a crushing absolute defeat. The fall was slow, agonizing, and public. The man who had spent his life putting other people's tragedies on display now became the star of his own humiliating spectacle, and the curtain simply would not fall. The bankers who had taken the reins of power were ruthless. They felt no reverence for his collection. To them, these weren't treasures, but assets, liquid funds to plug the holes in the sinking ship of his empire. The great sell-off began. The treasures he had collected from around the world with a maniac's obsession, which were a part of his very flesh, his ego, were now put on the auction block like the property of a bankrupt shopkeeper. In department store windows, next to mannequins in fashionable dresses, appeared suits of armor from his arsenal. Greek vases that remembered the age of Pericles were sold at a discount. Entire rooms, brought over from English castles, went for a pittance. Every strike of the auctioneer's gavel was a blow to his heart. He read reports of these auctions in the newspapers, no longer his own, and watched as his legacy, his immortality of stone and wood, was atomized, slipping into other hands. The castle on the hill, his Xanadu, became for him a symbol of this humiliation. He still lived there, but it was no longer his kingdom. It was his prison. He wandered the echoing halls, past dust-sheeted furniture and empty pedestals from which the statues had been removed. He could no longer build anything, change anything. He was merely a custodian in his own museum, which was being sold off piece by piece. Along with his empire, his health was also failing him. The body he had always considered unshakable began to betray him. He, who had the mortal fear of illness and death, was now forced to face them every day, an aging, sick lion deprived of its pride and its territory. Fate delivered the final blow in May of 1947. The doctors delivered their verdict. His ailing heart could no longer withstand life on the isolated hill far from proper medical care. He had to leave, to abandon his paradise, his Eden, which he had spent nearly 30 years building. He didn't argue. He no longer had the strength to fight. A procession of several cars descended slowly down the winding road, past the enclosures where the animals had long since vanished. He looked out the window at his creation, at the Spanish towers bathed in the setting sun. He was looking for the last time, and he knew it. He would never return. Death did not find him in his kingdom, not in the Gothic bedroom with its view of the ocean. It found him 4 years later in an ordinary, unremarkable house in Beverly Hills. He died in his sleep, surrounded by nurses, far from the place that had been the sole meaning of his life. After he was gone, the castle was well and truly orphaned. It stood on the hill, enormous, unfinished, half empty, the ghost of a dream whose master had died in exile. The wind still sang in its towers, as it always had, but now it was not just a song of loneliness. It was a requiem for a king who tried to build himself an eternity, but could not even postpone his own death. The king was dead, but the kingdom remained, gigantic, expensive, meaningless. It loomed over the heirs and the Hearst Corporation like an impossible obligation. 5 sons, raised in the shadow of this stone monster, looked upon it with dread. Maintaining this leviathan was impossible. Taxes, security, endless repairs. The expenses were astronomical. A private dream had turned into an unbearable burden. And then, in 1957, 6 years after the death of its creator, a decision was made, one full of bitter irony. The Hearst Corporation donated the castle and 127 acres of surrounding land to the state of California. There was one condition: the family would retain the right to use it for their own events. But the message was clear. The most personal, most private, most egotistical space in America was being given over to the public. What was built as a fortress for one man, a bastion against a hostile world, was now becoming public property. The gates that once opened only for Hollywood stars and heads of estate were thrown open for all, for teachers, farmers, tourists with cameras, for those very common people whose opinions Hearst so skillfully manipulated, but whom he would have never let cross his threshold. Time had passed its verdict, and that verdict was a mockery. The castle, conceived as a monument to one man's eternal glory, survived only because it ceased to belong to him. It turned into a state park, an attraction, a machine for making money, but no longer for the Hearst family, but for the treasury of the state of California. Today, endless rivers of people flow through its halls. They listen to the guides' stories, click their tongues in admiration of the wealth, and take millions of selfies against the backdrop of another's collapsed ambition. They don't see the ghosts. They don't hear the whispers of the past. To them, it's just a set piece, impressive but soulless, of the passions, tragedies, jealousy, and loneliness that simmered within these walls. Only a stone, gilding, and short captions on museum plaques remain. So what truly remains? What has outlived its creator? Fiction remains. To the entire world, this place will forever remain Xanadu from Citizen Kane, a symbol of futility, not greatness. And then there are them, the only living creatures that still remember their mad king. On the hills around, amidst the sun-scorched grass, herds roam. Descendants of the very same zebras released into the wild during the Great Depression. They are a living, moving reminder that even the most powerful will cannot completely subjugate nature. They graze on the slopes of the enchanted hill, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. They are the true legacy, untamed, free, and silent witnesses to the fact that, in the end, all that remains of a man who tried to buy immortality is irony, and very strange animals roaming on someone else's land. We've walked through halls built of newspaper lies and marble ambitions, and we saw not just a castle, but the materialized will of one man, his war with reality, his attempt to buy immortality piece by piece. But this colossus, built on a foundation of hubris, turned out to be merely the world's most expensive stage for loneliness. If a person is capable of reshaping the entire world to their will, subjugating nature and buying history, can they ever fill the emptiness inside themselves? And what ultimately remains of such a titanic will? Unyielding stone, or just the quiet, ironic whisper of time? This story is not a period, but an ellipsis. Share in the comments what thoughts this story awakened in you. Your like and subscription is the best support for creating new films that explore the boundaries of human ambition.